The rains didn't come, so the nomad set out to walk across the desert, looking for pasture where he could settle with his family. Almost as soon as he began walking, he came upon a patch of green young grass. On it was a hut made of strong branches, covered with freshly woven mats and swept clean. The hut was empty. The man went back to his wife and told her that after just one day of walking, he had found the perfect place. But 2 days later, when he returned to the pasture with his wife and baby, they found a stranger standing in the doorway of the hut. This stranger was not tall, but he was thickly built, and he had very white teeth and smooth skin. Hawa would shiver with pleasure, and I with fear. The stranger said, "You have a wife and a child. Take the house. You are welcome to it." And he smiled. The young nomad thought this stranger was remarkably friendly and thanked him. He invited the stranger to visit any time. But the wife felt uncomfortable around the stranger. The baby, too, cried as soon as he cast eyes on this man. That night, an animal sneaked into their hut and stole the baby out of his bed. The man had eaten well and slept heavily. He heard nothing. Such misfortune. The stranger visited the nomad and his wife to tell them of his sorrow. But when he spoke, the wife noticed that there were tiny pieces of red meat between his teeth, and one of those strong white teeth was just a little bit broken. The man stayed on with the couple in the house. For a whole year, the grass stayed green and the rains came, so there was no reason to move on. The wife had another baby in that hut, another beautiful son. But again, when the child was barely 1 season old, an animal came in the night and grabbed the baby in its jaws. This time, the child's father ran after the creature, but he was too slow to catch up. The third time, the nomad caught up with the creature and struggled with it, but the animal overpowered him. Again it ate the baby. Finally, after her third baby was eaten, the wife told the nomad she would leave him. So now that stupid nomad had lost everything. "So what have you learned?" my grandmother would shout at us. We knew the answer. That nomad had been lazy. He had taken the first pasture he found, even though there had to be something wrong with it. He had been stupid. He had failed to read the signs, the signals which the baby and the woman had instinctively felt. The stranger was really he who rubs himself with a stick, the monstrous being who transforms himself into a hyena and devours children. We had spotted it. The nomad had been slow of mind, slow of limb, weak in strength and valor. He deserved to lose everything. My grandmother's stories could be chilling. There were stories about an ugly old witch whose name was People Slayer or People Butcher, who had the power to transform herself to adopt the face of someone you liked and respected, and who at the last minute lunged at you, laughing in your face, ha 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 ha, before she slaughtered you with a long, sharp knife that she had been hiding under the folds of her robe all along, and then ate you up. My grandmother told us tales from when she was young, of the bands of fighters who raided the desert, stealing animals and women, burning settlements. She told us about all the unrecorded disasters of her life and her parents' lives, the pandemics of plague and malaria and drought that left whole regions barren of life. She told us also about her life, the good times when the rains came and made everything green, when streams of water suddenly raced through the dried riverbeds, and there was milk and meat in abundance. She tried to teach us how that led to decadence, how when the grass grows green, herders become lazy and children grow fat, how men and women mix in singing and drumming at twilight, and how that erodes their watchfulness so that they fail to spot danger. Such mingling, she warned us, leads to competition, conflict, disaster. Sometimes in my grandmother's stories there were brave women, mothers like my mother, who used their cunning and their courage to save their children from danger. This made us feel safe, in a way. My grandmother and my mother, too, were brave and clever. They would surely be able to save us when our time came to face the monsters. In Somalia, little children learn quickly to be alert to betrayal. Things are not always what they seem. Even a small slip can be fatal. The moral of every one of my grandmother's stories rested on our honor. We must be strong, clever, suspicious. We must obey the rules of the clan. Suspicion is good, especially if you're a girl. For girls can be taken, or they may yield. And if a girl's virginity is despoiled, she not only obliterates her own honor, she also damages the honor of her father, uncles, brothers, male cousins. There is nothing worse than to be the agent of such catastrophe. Even though we loved her stories, mostly we ignored my grandmother. She herded us around, much as she did the goats that she would tether to our tree, but we were more unruly. Stories and squabbles were our pastimes. I don't think I ever saw a toy till I was 8 and we had moved to Saudi Arabia. We pestered each other. Hawa and Mahat ganged up on me, or Hawa and I ganged up on Mahat. But my brother and I never did anything as a team. We hated each other. My grandmother always said this was because I was born just 1 year after Mahat. I stole Ma's lap from him. We had no father because our father was in prison. I had no memory of him at all. Most of the adults I knew grew up in the deserts of Somalia. The easternmost country in Africa and one of the poorest, Somalia juts into the Indian Ocean, cradling the tip of the Arabian Peninsula like a protective hand before dropping down the coast to Kenya. My family were nomads who moved constantly through the northern and northeastern deserts to find pasture for their herds. They would settle sometimes for a season or two. When there was no longer enough water and pasture, or if the rains failed, they picked up their hat and stacked their mats onto camels and walked, trying to find somewhere better to keep their herds alive. My grandmother learned to weave dry grass so tight you could carry water for miles in one of her pitchers. She could make her own small domed house out of bent boughs and woven mats, then dismantle it and load it onto a nasty-tempered transport camel. When my grandmother was about 10 years old, her father, an Isaac herder, died. Her mother married her uncle. This is a common practice. It saves a dowry and trouble. When my grandmother was about 13, that uncle received a proposal for my grandmother's hand from a wealthy nomad named Artan, who was about 40 years old. Artan was Dulbahante, which was a good bloodline of the Darod. He was widely respected, skilled with animals, and a good navigator. He could read his environment so well that he always knew when to move and where to go to find rain. Other clan members came to him to arbitrate their disputes. Artan was already married, but he and his wife had only one child, a daughter who was a little younger than my grandmother. When he decided to take another wife, Artan first chose the father of the bride. He must be a man from a good clan with a decent reputation. The girl must be hard-working, strong, young, and pure. My grandmother, Ibado, was all that. Artan paid a bride price for her. A few days after Artan married her and took her away, my grandmother bolted. She managed to walk almost all the way back to her mother's camp before Artan caught up with her. He agreed to let her rest for a bit with her mother to recover. Then, after a week, her stepfather took her to Artan's camp and told her, "This is your destiny." For the rest of her life, my grandmother was irreproachable in every way. She raised 8 girls and 1 boy, and never was there a whisper of gossip about their virtue or their work. She instilled willpower and obedience and a sense of honor in her children. She grazed animals, fetched firewood, built fences of sticks laced with thorn branches. She had hard hands and a hard head, and when her husband hosted clan meetings in his role as a clan arbiter, she kept her girls safely apart from the men and the singing and the drums. They could listen only from afar to the poetry competitions and watch as the men traded goods and tales. My grandmother showed no jealousy toward her older co-wife, though she stayed out of her way. When the older co-wife died, my grandmother tolerated the presence of her haughty stepdaughter, Khadija, the girl who was almost her own age.